Hey everybody, welcome to We've Got Nostalgia, a Doof Media podcast series where we look back on our time with Wildbow's web serial Ward. My name is Matt Freeman, and I am your host.
And I am Scott Daly, and I am your passenger. Get it? Because it's like it's a parahumans joke.
Oh, I get it now.
Matt, it has been 2 years, if you can believe it. It has been 2 years since we wrapped up our coverage of Wildbow's Ward. Our last episode after Ward was released on May 13th, 2020. We were in the middle of a pandemic that now here 2 years in the future has been totally solved. And and we thought it would be fun to kind of come back 2 years later and think about this book and our time with it, and see how things have changed over the past 2 years. Because, I don't know, Matt. I just I'm really interested in how people's opinions towards the art they consume changes over time.
Yeah, right. I mean, what was interesting in our particular case is we have a detailed record of every single thought that we had related to this book back when we were reading it.
Yeah. And
it's not like I'm going to go back and listen to everything that I said about it, practically speaking, but it is interesting to consider like what stuck with me, what maybe didn't stick with me.
Yeah.
And that, that's fine. That's not some indictment of the story, but definitely as I was thinking back on it, I was realizing like, yeah, some of these things from the story did actually kind of become fixtures of my worldview, to put it broadly. And then, a lot of other stuff is just like, yeah, it's a story that I read. It's not life changing, but yeah, sure. As you say, very interesting to reflect back on things, especially something that was this important to us.
Yeah, definitely. And honestly, we thought about doing this a year ago, and we even, made a post in the Parahuman subreddit about it, kind of soliciting responses about what people are thinking about Ward a year later. And we never released the episode. We never recorded that episode because that subreddit became a place for people to just reignite old arguments about the book, and that is not the conversation we wanted to have. So we just kind of looked at that and people arguing about Ward again and said, yeah, let's take some more time away from this thing. And so we waited another year, and here we are. And I'm excited about this. Matt, you and I have not talked about Wildbow in literally 24 months.
Yeah, that's true. So I mean, I have some thoughts. I spent all day kind of just letting myself dip back into that world and remember, a lot's changed for sure. I mean, we've been doing our Stephen King podcast this entire time, and I feel like I've changed in many ways and picked up more tools and more ways of looking at things since then. And one thing that's kind of going to be fun to me in this conversation is trying to apply those to the Parahumans stories.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this conversation is probably going to mostly focus on Ward, probably. I mean, I think obviously we read Worm before that and we just went right into it without taking any breaks. But I don't know. I look at our coverage of Ward as something unique and different as compared to everything else we've done. Like even Kingslingers right now is covering Stephen King books that have been written and have been published for years. Like covering something live is just a complete different animal altogether, as our friends over at Pale Reflections are experiencing right now as they move into year 3 of Pale. And so I don't know. I guess the place to start with is, have you reread any Parahuman stuff since we wrapped up the show?
Well, not in a bulk fashion, but I think I have gone in and reread an interlude a couple times here and there. Mm-hmm. Just the ones that I loved, but not often. I mean, you and I, between all of our projects, we have like basically 2 books a month of reading that we're obligated to.
Yeah.
Plus, extra sometimes.
Yeah.
So I don't,
plus that thing called reading for fun that we occasionally get to do.
Yeah, well, that's kind of the thing is this would have to fit into my reading for fun budget, which right now that's just my Elden Ring budget. So so no, I haven't really. Have you dipped back into it?
Honestly, I have not read a single word of this book since we we left it behind until today when I went back and I did read the final chapter of Ward again, just to like get myself into the mindset of Wildbow's writing and exactly where we left that book off. I kept current with Pale for all of one arc, and then I fell behind, and then the idea of trying to catch up with that story is so daunting to me that I just haven't touched it. I mean, look, I'm not like disappointed with myself or anything about that. I wish the only regret with that is that I can't be listening to Ruben and Elliot do their thing because I haven't read the book, so I've just kind of had to leave behind listening to their podcast, which bums me out. But I'm okay with the break we've taken. I keep telling myself I'll get to it eventually, but gosh, it's a big book now.
Yeah. That's one interesting thing that we could talk about is the difference of the experience in reading a completed web serial versus a web serial being written week by week.
Yeah.
Because I read all of Worm when it was already done. I read all of Twig when it was already done. No, that's a complete lie. That's the opposite of the point I was trying to make. I read Twig week to week, or chapter to chapter. And like, it's such a completely different reading experience. And then of course we read Worm week to week, obviously. Ward, I can't talk. We read Ward week to week as it was coming out. And I think for me personally, I actually think that I prefer waiting for a thing to be done and then kind of binging it. Like, the thing is, there's such different experiences. There's such qualitatively different experiences, and they both have pros and cons to them.
Yeah.
The one thing about reading it week to week is that you don't like lose your mind for a month as you're binging something that's that enormous, which is what happened to me with Pact, for example, where like I was so like into it that I was like, like your mental state is being affected when it's like a really dark story. And I love dark stories, but it's just true. So all that being said, like the reason I haven't kept up with Pact, although I think I stayed on the train for maybe five or six arcs, I was just like, I think I will prefer to just read this when it's done. And I don't know, I'd be interested to hear other people's thoughts on that. Both obviously interesting. And I feel like I'm missing something from the web serial experience by not keeping up with it, because part of the fun is always like getting into the threads and theorizing with people and stuff. I think it's just that I have like so much other stuff going on. I'm like, I don't have time for that,
Yeah, that's where I'm at. I mean, with the responsibilities that we already have, the responsibilities of my other job and my family, like just the idea of following along with that live is something I just don't think I can do anymore. And frankly, I don't know if it was ever something I could do. Like, I don't know if I would have been able to keep up with Ward had I not had to do a show on it. Like, having to do the show every week is what kind of made me read those chapters, even when there were moments where, as much as I was enjoying the book, I just kind of didn't feel like reading 10,000 words on a computer screen this afternoon.
Yeah.
But I had to, so I did it. And so yeah, not having to have that constant responsibility, it's very easy to fall behind, and then it just becomes really daunting. I mean, it's the same with like the other entertainment I enjoy. Like, I'm watching so many television shows right now. I'm probably concurrently watching like 10 TV shows with my wife, and there's at least 2 of them that we've fallen behind on. And just the idea of like, oh, we got to watch 4 more episodes of this one to catch up. Let's just do it. Let's just deal with that later. Let's just let it fall behind. And that's kind of the way web serials work for me. And I like, we've had many people over the course of the last 2 years kind of say, I hope you do web serials again. Like, here's this great one and this great one and this great one. And I don't know, man. I don't know if I love the medium as much as as other people do, I guess. Like, it's not that I don't enjoy serialized storytelling in general. I just think like I like having a book and reading the book and being finished and putting it down and picking up something else. Like, I love the idea of seasons, right? Like with television, or like, for a Stephen King example, since he's on our brain, he released the book, The Green Mile, in like 5 different books. He released that serially. So he had 5 different novella-sized books that he released over the course of a few months. And like the idea of getting that and reading that and being done, and then the next one comes out in a few months and then you pick up that. But like the idea of the web serial is like concurrent, constant updates that just keep coming and coming and coming and coming. It's almost too much for me sometimes.
Yeah, I think it can even change over the course of your life as
Sure.
you know, maybe you lose slots for certain forms of entertainment, or then maybe other slots open up. You know, I mean, one thing I think a lot of people noticed is that their overall ability to keep up with podcasts just completely fell off during the more, you know, restrictive phases of the pandemic because people weren't driving.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, so like you're you know, you're still just sitting around for all those hours you would have been driving, but it's like, yeah, but you got other stuff to do. Like driving's the perfect time to listen to that kind of content. And when that slot goes away, you're not going to say to yourself like, well, I got to find time to listen to the pod. That's just not what it's for.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way, like I think at different times in my life, I've had like a natural slot where it made a lot of sense for me to, you know, like I would get into the habit of just like crashing after work and pulling out my phone and reading, you know, Pact, for example. That was like just my kind of, that's where it fit in. And then, you know, different things shift around, and then that opening kind of disappears, and different forms of media lend themselves to different situations in your life. So
yeah, I also think it helped that I had a job at the time we were reading Ward that allowed me to read the book in the middle of the day, that I could get away with doing that. And I just don't have that anymore right now. So, you know, it's just, yeah, things change and it's different. But I'm curious though, to move on to kind of Ward specifically. How have your feelings on this book changed over the past couple of years? Because I think we talked about this in our final episode. The idea that the further you move away from something, the more your experience with it flattens naturally a bit. There's less dimension to it because you have less of a clear memory of it. And that can change. And maybe the stuff that you liked gets elevated, or the stuff that annoyed you gets elevated, or the story itself just kind of fades to the point where you really don't have an opinion. So what do you feel about Ward right now?
Well, over time, what has happened is I think parahumans in general, including Ward, has kind of become a bunch of parables that help me think through moral conflicts or emotional situations. Because that is kind of what the story is. It's a whole both of them. They're a whole bunch of interesting characters who are given interesting flaws, and there's so many of them that whatever you're struggling with in your life, you can usually think of a parahuman's character who this kind of maps onto, or at least reminds you of, and or not just yourself, but people in your life. You can kind of think to yourself like, you know, these problems you're having really kind of remind me of Ashley. And maybe you don't say that to them, but
I hope you don't, because I don't know how they would react to that at all.
If you know them really well, you can say that to them. If you don't know them really well, then you just use that as a little bit of a scaffolding for your thinking. Like, okay, well, how, you know, let's assume for the sake of, you know, thinking through the problem that is a good model of this person's psychology. What helped Ashley in that situation, right? And you know, I think the stories are actually full of a lot of wisdom, which is interesting because they're, you know, rip-roaring, entertaining superhero stories, but I think there's a lot of like extremely careful and precise psychology in them, which is frankly the thing that I always kind of thought was special and unique about them, because you can get superheroes punching each other anywhere, really. So yeah, that's what stands out to me after all this time is the moral dimension and the psychological dimension. You know, I think a lot of the plot stuff, I don't want to say faded, because I could probably still give you a quite accurate summary of Ward. It's just anything that you haven't read for a while, you just it just kind of fades into the background.
Yeah, the plot is the first thing that I lose as I move further away from something. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Like the overall movements of the story, I think I could pick up on still, but for the most part, I don't really remember the details of a lot of the plot, but the character and the character movements and the things the characters go through, and like you said, the theming are things that really still stick in my brain a whole lot. And honestly, the things that I continue to remain impressed about. I mean, I when we finished this book, I think we were very, very positive on it generally. I think we had a few quibbles and complaints here and there as the story went on. I think I felt it was a little too meandery at times, but overall, we've really enjoyed our time with it. And I mean, for me personally, the good parts have just like elevated to a point where like they will be things I think about when I think about like all-time best pulling off of what a storyteller was trying to do, you know, like when I think about the things Victoria went through, when I think about Ashley was a great thing you brought up. When I think about Tristan and Byron, actually, these are things, and especially Rain, I think actually is probably the one I think about the most. These are things that like I just continually in the back of my mind. Sometimes you'll just be sitting there and you'll just start thinking about it and be like, I can't believe this guy wrote this story and tried to do these things. Like, you know, we talked about this on our final episode, but the degree of difficulty for which Wildbow was setting out with this story was extremely high, right? He's telling a story that is by its design kind of disappointing. Like, you know, I was thinking about, I think I saw a comment on Parahumans because I still occasionally peruse the subreddit and see what the people are talking about. And I saw someone say something to the effect of like, the existence of Ward kind of ruins Taylor's ending. And I don't, it's not that I agree with that. I don't, but like just the idea that like this girl sacrificed basically everything she had to keep things going. And then another book comes along that says, okay, yeah, but turns out that actually wasn't enough and nothing's actually fixed and things are just getting worse. The only thing we can say right now is, hey, we're alive still, so we have the chance to fix it, but nothing's actually fixed. It is inherently kind of like taking an ending of one book and saying, sorry, you didn't do as good as you thought you did. And that is like by design disappointing. And then a lot of the book is beat after beat of, oh, you thought that you were getting better? Psych, you weren't actually. Sorry. And that is unsatisfying. And it is like powerful and fascinating. And I think most importantly, true in a lot of ways. It's honest. It's an honest portrayal of people suffering with guilt and with trauma and all these things, and how fucking hard it is to recover from these things. But that is inherently unsatisfying. And so like, I think as you move away from it, you forget the emotionally unsatisfying parts. And you just remember the part was like, oh no, man, that was really great when Victoria and her wretch like bonded in the shard space, this beautiful moment where they finally understood each other. And that's like, you forget about the pain and the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours that it took to get there. And you're just like, oh man, that was fucking awesome.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up that specific moment because as far as I can tell, that was one of the only moments of anything that could be called catharsis.
Yeah.
In I'm going to be honest, I kind of lump Worm and Ward together, which is not maybe the best because they're very different stories, but only moment of catharsis in both of those stories. And I think that's like on purpose. Like that's the, yeah. I've thought about how much trouble I had articulating, like, what is the thesis? What is the theme of Ward? And I feel like, you know, even when we were in the midst of it and studying it and living and breathing it, I would sort of just say some word salad about trauma and recovery. And I don't want to be too hard on myself. I think I had some ideas, but I never felt like it was, I never felt like I had the cleanest articulation of it. And now it's not like I'm, you know, oh, now I have the cleanest articulation, but now like the part of it that has stuck with me, the thesis of the part of it that has stuck with me is, how do you live your life if you are a being, you know, a person that is permanently unfixably at odds with yourself? Mm-hmm. And you could see this as like a way of implementing the, you know, the character's wants versus their needs makes good drama concept in storytelling. But also I just think it's a good lens for looking at psychology. Like, you know, that this is how we all are actually. Like we all have different things that we want that are in contradiction to each other. And if you got this, then it would actually make it impossible to get that. And then you have needs that are unaddressed that you don't want to acknowledge. And these are just
Yeah.
natural parts of being human. And that's really what the story is. And it elevates it using the superhero tropes, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that truth of existence is actually very like, it's kind of immune to real catharsis. Like it just is true that sometimes you will want to contradictory things. There's no, and there is no magical, clever thing that you can do to get both and to have your cake and eat it too. Life doesn't actually work that way. Life doesn't usually actually provide you with a nice storytelling solution that gives you your catharsis, or if you're struggling with guilt or something, life doesn't usually provide you with an opportunity to just do this one thing, snap your fingers, have a good cry, and it's all better now. Everything's better now. You've recovered.
Mm-hmm.
You've recovered from your trauma. You've recovered from your guilt. You're pristine again. You're whole again. You can just move on. Doesn't work that way. And Wildbow, in his stories, I think that's his articulation of this idea. Is Wildbow is anti-catharsis. There's no catharsis. Everybody just lives with their shit and they do their best. And sometimes they take 6 steps forward and 7 steps back. And that happens a bunch of times because that's how life actually is. And you're right, it is disappointing. And it's kind of unsatisfying in certain ways. And I think a lot of the complaints about Ward back when we were reading it were that kind of tenor, where it's people who are frustrated. They're like, oh, like why is this not feeling the way I want it to? And I think Wildbow is not. He's like, no, it's not what this is.
Right. Yeah. I mean, especially when compared to Worm, which was for a book that I think is exploring a lot of these same things in different ways. It is also, in many ways, an escapist fantasy about a girl who has been, like royally beaten down by life, like taking back some control over it. And that is kind of satisfying in a way, the parts of that. And I think Worm is way more complicated than that, but I think it's a fair read to go into that book and be like I feel good because Taylor is getting control of all the systems and people in her life that have treated her miserably. And so that's great kind of escapist fantasy type of literature. And that's what people look for a lot of times. And so if you come to Ward with that mindset, yeah, you're going to be really annoyed and pissed off because basically no one would ever describe Ward as an escapist fantasy. Ever. I have never wanted to be a character in a superhero story less than in this book. That would be absolutely miserable. And yeah, I mean, so if you come to books looking for, a good time, which is not to say that it is not a fun book. I think there are many moments of fun in the book. But it also is brutal and is exhausting. And I do wonder, and I'm sure people have done this. Of course, neither of us have, but I do wonder what the kind of binge read would look like of this book, what it would feel like. Because in some ways you could argue it would be overwhelming because you would be experiencing all the stuff at once. In other ways, you could argue we experienced depression over the course of a year and a half, instead of a couple months, So I don't know. I don't know which way things would be better in that regard.
I think there's pros and cons. Again, it's like this. Sure. It's like kind of like I said earlier. Like I think when you binge it, you do actually see the forest and you don't get lost in the trees so much. Yeah. The downside is you literally forget about half of the trees, whereas the way that we went through it, we probably remember, very, minor little, interactions between capes because we talked about it for 27 minutes, about, one of the anime posse's costumes or whatever. Like if you thought about it for a minute, you would remember that. Whereas if we just blown through it, you'd be like, what are you talking about? I don't even know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But that's the thing about being where we are now is now, I feel like I can see the forest a little bit better. Like a metaphor that I've thought about is like reading a story like this. It's like you're wandering around like a landscape that's full of like sculptures and statues, and you can you can detect the relationships between the statues that are around you, and you know, maybe this one is looking at that one, and maybe this one is kneeling to that one, and then it's only once you've walked kind of through the field and you look back at the entire tableau that you can see the whole pattern that was being told by all of the statues, but you can't really see that until you're done, and not only done, but had some time to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, and stories need to like kind of carve a space in your brain, and they can't really settle into that space until you've walked away and had some time away from it for a while. So yeah, and I think it's interesting because I loved Victoria so much, but I think the space that has been carved in my brain the most, I gestured toward this earlier, is Rain, for whatever reason. And I think it's just because it's partially because I really love the character and I really love his journey through the story. It's also because from like a writing conceit, it's really great because like Wildbow starts Rain at the end of his arc, basically, or the end of what you would expect his arc to be. You know, the brainwashed cult member who did horrible things. He's realized those things were horrible. He's working towards seeking forgiveness, and like any other story, you pat yourself on the back and say, "Ah, yes, good. Look, these people can be redeemed. There's hope. There's light shining on the top of that hill." And Ward takes that and goes, "Actually, this is really hard, and that he's not even close to being done." And really exploring the ways in which existing the world will continue to challenge your ideas of accepting forgiveness, allowing you to forgive yourself, and attempting to live in a world after you've done these terrible things, and are good enough to recognize them as terrible.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually, out of the members of Breakthrough that I think about the most, probably, you know, Victoria and then Tristan and Byron, kind of as a unit, which, you know, they'd probably be mad if I said that, but their story is kind of inextricably tied together, right? They kind of share the same interlude arc.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, each of them have that thing where there's like a lingering sort of sense of things being unfinished, which again I think goes to this idea of a feeling of unsatisfaction and intentional frustration and unsatisfaction. Because, you know, I think a lot about the fact that like Kinsey's ending is just Kinsey continuing to do Kinsey shit. You know, she sneaks into the prison so she can talk to Chris, and it's like, this is exactly the kind of like rule breaking, like you're gonna get in so much trouble, like you're following the impulse to use your power to basically get access to people.
Yeah.
The same thing she's been doing the whole story that she shouldn't be doing. That's literally the last thing that she does in the story. And I always, it's like, you're like, oh my God, like seriously, like we're ending the story here with this character. And again, that's the point is,
you
know, she has this conversation with Bonesaw, and Bonesaw is like, you know, I'm a little bit farther down the road than you. I'm still capable of having a freak out and trying to turn people into lampshades, but I'm doing better. And that's the way it's framed, is like, it's a problem that you're always struggling with.
I think that's right. And even I think what the book is saying is even asking the question, is Kenzie better? Is Victoria better? Is Amy better? Those are the wrong questions, is what the book is saying. Is that like, no, of course they're not. Of course they're not better. They probably will never be. They will never be all better, all done, did it. It's always going to be work. It's always going to be a conscious thing that they have to do, and that's not fair. It's not fair that they have to go through that, but that's just the way it is. And they're taking steps, and they're going to relapse, and that there's going to be horrible moments, and they're going to keep working at it. And there is hope in that. There is a little bit of what you were talking about here. There's a little bit of positivity that comes out of that, of optimism that comes out of that, even in this very kind of sad, you know, uncertain future that our characters live in. I
guess maybe, to loop back to what I was saying, the the insight or the kind of crystallization for me was realizing like there's really no difference between what you and I struggle with throughout our lives and what these superheroes are struggling with in the sense of what Wildbow is trying to actually talk about, where you're never going to be perfected.
Yeah.
You know, you're never going to have done all of the work and dealt with all of the things that you feel bad about, that you feel angry about, that you feel wronged or, you know, or guilty if it was your fault, or, you know, problems with relationships that are just not quite right. You're never going to be perfected. You're always going to be struggling. There's always going to be compromises. There's always going to be sacrifices or things that don't line up or don't work the way you want them to. And does that mean that progress is impossible? No. Does that mean that being happy is impossible? No. You can find meaning in all sorts of places. And I think that's the you know, the parts of the story that are actually beautiful and positive and kind of delightful are like the times when Breakthrough is kind of working together and firing on all cylinders, and, you know, or bantering or something along those lines, where you're seeing that these people in the act of coming together to get better, they're creating something beautiful amongst themselves.
Yeah.
Something that creates their own meaning there.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right that, you know, existence is hard. It's often disappointing. It's cruel. But this central idea that, hey, if we come together, we can create something new. And despite us all still suffering, despite us all still going through these things and not getting better and having to work towards it, we can create something beautiful and something that's worth hanging around for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that.
And this central idea that, you know, one of the things that's really stuck in my brain is the central idea that everyone is suffering from something.
Mm-hmm.
that I think Wildbow did so beautifully. Like I for some reason, the one conversation that I have a very clear memory of you and I having is, and I don't even remember the cape's name, but the realization when one of the capes turns into a Titan, right? And this idea that like you were ready to hate this person, to strike them down for the bad things that they were doing, and look, here's the consequence now. And it's not as if that means we must forgive these people and treat them all nice. No. But like, we're all going through stuff and we're all suffering from it. And when we isolate the baddies, they're just going to blow up in our face.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of Wildbow's fortes in all of all these stories is emphasizing the humanity of even the people who we don't like.
100%. Speaking of not liking, though, I guess one of the things I did want to talk to you about is a lot of people didn't like this book, and I don't want to relitigate like why the book is good. But what I want to talk to you about is one of the things I've been thinking about a lot over the past 2 years is how doing a show like this changes what you would call good and what you would call bad. Because one of the things I was thinking about a lot is the central idea that what did I need from Ward at the end of the day? What did I need from this book? And honestly, what I needed from this book was I needed there to be something in the 2 chapters that came out every week that gave me enough to talk about on a podcast, right? In an entertaining way, in an intelligent, entertaining way. So what I needed from the story was depth and complexity and interesting topics that we could kind of process and digest live. That's what I needed from Ward. And Ward gave me that every week, week in, week out. You know, doesn't matter what part of the book we were in, doesn't matter, you know, if it's a chapter, a section that most people seem to not like, it consistently and constantly gave me that. And so like when I say, yes, Ward was good, it's because that's what I needed it to be. And that's what it was. And that is so different from what anyone else reading this book would be thinking about. Like, because an average reader is approaching this book wanting a completely different set of things. And I don't, it distorts in my mind the way, you know, like a review of this book from me would be so different from a review of this book from anyone else, I think.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, once again, you know, everyone's review is conditioned implicitly on what they expect from that medium. And that's the interesting thing about web serials is there's such a different medium that I think people try to use the tools of like thinking about novels to think about web serials,
Yeah.
and then they say, oh, this is flawed, and I would say, well, it's not. That's not what it is. You can't think about it that way. It's a totally different thing. And you said earlier it's meandering, and it's like it definitely is meandering. Every web serial that I've ever read gets meandering, and I think it's because they do that thing where they are more like a TV show than like a movie or a book. We talked about this previously, where they'll have a season where the writers are different, and in Wildbow's case, like he'll have an arc or two where he's interested in some particular idea that he'll kind of follow down the rabbit hole, and eventually we kind of get back to what you might call the main trunk of the plot, and it might leave you with a feeling of like, well, what did we really accomplish there? And it's like, well, we were entertained is what we accomplished.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, it's I don't know. I wanted to talk a little bit about how obvious it's become to me that like Wildbow is specifically a master of the web serial medium, like as a medium. Because
Sure.
especially now that we've done this long running deep dive into Stephen King, who is he's a novelist. He has mastered the form of the novel.
Yeah.
The novel, and that emphasizes how distinct novels are from web serials, because like Wildbow does these things where he has these amazing story twists, these incredibly incredibly tense game changer moments at the ends of chapters that just leave you like, oh my god, and then you want to run online and talk about like, oh my god, like what did that mean, what's going to happen, the amazing like format fuckery where he makes us think that March well, first he makes us think March has killed Vista, and then he makes us think March has killed Foil, and then it's like, no, gotcha, right? And you're like, oh my god, this is amazing. And that's the kind of thing you just can't do in a book, because you're just like, you turn the page or you just keep reading, and it doesn't work. And so I think this is one thing he's thinking about as he's writing, is he's kind of being a bit of a stage magician who's aware of his audience,
Yeah.
in a very like alive sense of like, how are they gonna respond literally the moment I hit publish on this. What is the reaction going to be in the living, breathing community as it exists?
Yeah, I think you're right here. This is such a good point, and it's something that when I approached these books, especially Worm, I approached it as a novel because why wouldn't I, right? Like it was a completed thing. I had never read a web serial before. We were not reading it live, and so I approached it as a novel, and so my critique and my analysis of it was novel based. And yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we kind of learned very quickly in Ward is that it doesn't work that way. Like covering the thing live, that's not what it is. And I do see people like constantly ask like, when is Worm going to be published? When is this going to happen? And like, I'm not saying that it shouldn't happen, or that it will never happen, but like, I think you're absolutely right that this guy has kind of like claimed this medium of storytelling, and he's living in it because it's the one that he seems to like, and it's the one that's working for him, and it is unique and needs to be treated separately. You cannot come to it with the same tools that you would come to a novel and expect everything to lay out in that way. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah I think a lot of the story expectations don't quite line up.
No.
I mean, just the simple fact that one of like the next question I was going to ask you was actually like, what interlude stands out to you the most in retrospect? And the whole concept of interlude is something that almost I think wouldn't work in a novel format.
Yeah, I mean, the novels have had interludes before, but you're right that it doesn't feel the same. Yeah, and like I'm trying to think. I'm trying to say words as I think of an answer to your question, but I think generally, like, I think you could cut 50% of the words out of the story and like make a story that talks about the same themes. If you wanted to release a novel about it, like, I think you could do that. And I'm not saying it would be better or worse, but I think it could be done. And that just goes to show how different this medium is. And it's not like I'm saying Wildbow writes too much, we need to cut 50% of a story. I'm not saying that. It's just, it's a different medium. So to answer your question, it's kind of colored difficultly for me. the first thing that jumped into my mind is the Tristan Byron interludes, and I don't know if how much of that is wrapped up in the extreme pushback we got for the way we talked about those things, and so they're just the ones that are always kind of on my mind. I still love those interludes to death. I love that story. I find it really fascinating. I continue to find it fascinating the ways in which I think the book is cleverly showing how these two brothers are both kind of broken and failing to communicate with each other in a way that I think is more complex than a lot of what I saw the general read on it was, which is my complicated way of saying I still disagree with all the people that got mad at me. But
no,
that's fine.
I'm now even more sure that we were right. And the reason is, like, my kids are 2 years older, and I'm able to observe just like what are definitely just normal, healthy sibling dynamics, except the part of healthy sibling dynamics is conflict, and especially conflict when the kids want, well, there's one of this toy and they all want it, or 2 out of 3 of them want it at the same time, and they're going to fight over it, and they love each other as much as they possibly can, but they're going to fight over it, and they're going to bicker, and they're going to appeal to me to intercede on their behalf, and they're, in short, going to be children about it. And fundamentally, like, the great thing about the Tristan Byron story is it generalizes wonderfully to the idea of just having siblings. It's about twins specifically, but I feel like anybody who's had siblings has felt those feelings of frustration, and I think there's even a deeper sense in which, like, as a very small child, if your parent is paying more attention to the other sibling, then you feel like really bad, like much worse than is reasonable, and that's something that you always hear about when there's young children, and then that kind of gets baked into your brain. So and it elevates and escalates them to extreme levels, because that's what these stories do, right? You take this idea of 2 siblings that are so different from each other and are having specific conflict based around those differences because they are just completely different people and the way that's manifesting. And then you take that and you escalate it to fucking 11 by forcing them in constant contact with each other in a way that is specifically triggering to the ways in which they upset each other. And it's such a wonderful, fascinating idea that I love so much. And the only real reason I pushed back against the read that, Byron is just the abused one and Tristan is the abuser, and that's like the only level of complication in this whole relationship, that's it, there's nothing to read beyond it, is I just think that sells how beautifully drawn this thing is short a little bit. Like, I just think it's so much more complicated than that, in the best possible way, that it feels like if we just conclude in this black and white way, we're selling this whole thing short, which is not to say that Tristan did not do terrible, horrible things. Obviously he did, faking your brother's death and forcing him to live in a hell inside of you for months it was a bad call, Ripley. It was a bad call. He did a horrible, horrible thing. I'm not trying to justify or excuse that. All I'm saying is that when we meet these 2 brothers, they are 2 people that are in a conflict-ridden, contentious relationship with each other that is both pinging off of their specific personality types and the ways in which those personality types do not mesh well, but are forced to mesh well because they live together, because they are brothers, and they don't have a choice in that. And the fucking shards doing what they do say, oh, you're having conflict here in this, right? Let's make that 7,000 times worse. Yeah. Right. Because I think one thing we talked about back then is just the idea that if you were, physically chained to your siblings, I think most people grow up and then they become great friends with their siblings. I think that's that's the normal experience. If you graduated high school but you were chained at the wrists to your siblings, I don't think that relationship would evolve that way, because you really do need that space from each other to to actually come to appreciate each other and really realize, like, oh, this person is, like, it's really cool that I have this other adult who's, like, really similar to me, and we get along really well. Like that's really unique and special, actually. But
Yep.
if you're just like, it's because you're crammed into the same household with them that you can't see that when you're young. And that's the thing, is they've been denied the opportunity to grow beyond that. And I don't know, there's like, that's this is the like complaint that I have, or the conflict that I have with kind of different elements of the fandom, is like, look, Wildbow is providing these people who have done terrible things, be it Regent or Kraus or Tristan, as a way of thinking about yourself.
Yeah.
They're not there for you to be like, oh, that piece of shit, oh god, I hate him. Like that's okay. Like, yeah, I mean, on some level you're going to react that way, and that's probably the reaction like during the actual seconds of time where I'm actually reading the words. But that's like, okay, then you're done with that reaction, and then you get to have like the interesting, like introspective reaction.
I agree, and that's why I like. It's not necessarily that I disagree with the complaints that people had with our stuff, which, by the way, we still get emails and comments about that stupid interlude like all fucking time. And then I get to be angry all over again. But it's more that I just feel like if you're just going to paint it as black and white, you're just like not engaging with the book on the level I think it should be engaged at. So it's not like I care that you disagree with me. It's just like, no, I actually think that the book is doing something way more complicated than you're giving it credit for. And that's where my annoyance comes from.
Yeah. I mean, I clearly agree. And
yeah. But I love Tristan and Byron, and I think those interludes are fantastically well written. Like the being in their minds as the relationship escalates to these horrible levels, and just like recognizing how fucked they are, like just this idea that Byron is like hurting himself because of this, and he's having this relationship with this woman that he feels intense guilt about because of his brother, and then Tristan has like one thing that helps him like release tension, which is like going out and partying and stuff like that, and maybe, you know, elevating to something physical, and he can't do that either because that's taken away from him. And it's just like the way we get into their minds and the way we escalate this conflict bit by bit by bit until it boils over and Tristan makes the worst possible choice he could is just some of the best writing. And I know that's not what you asked, one interlude, it's several interludes over the course of that arc, but I love how that whole story plays out, and I love where we get to the end of it. I'm still very, very sad that Tristan doesn't make it out of this thing, but he does kind of. You know, I mean, it's a certain way.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that's my. You know, I share your inability to give a single succinct answer, and I think that's actually because this book is designed very differently than Worm was. I'm just not going to get any book name right today. So than Worm was, because Worm, if I recall correctly, there were only 2 interlude arcs where the whole arc was interludes, and those, you know, and those are among the most memorable arcs. No, 3. There's 3. It's 3 interlude arcs.
Yeah,
and those are among the most memorable arcs of the story. And then here we have basically. I'm probably not exactly right in this, but, you know, basically like multiple interludes culminating in something like an interlude arc for each of our breakthrough characters. And so there's more of them. We go into way more depth on them, and then we spend the whole rest of the story sort of with them, even though they're not the protagonist. And so, yeah, when if you ask me, like, what are the interludes I remember, like I might say like Eclipse, and it's like, no, Eclipse is an arc. Eclipse is 8 chapters, you know, or the Tristan Byron or the Rain stuff, which is even more kind of like, we're switching points of view, and like well, is, you know, we're in Snag's points of view, or we're in Love Lost point of view, but I kind of see those as all being part of Rain's story, actually. And you know, as far as single interludes go, I guess I can just say succinctly that the one that does stand out as distinctly memorable by itself is Dauntless. And I just thought that was like kind of a perfect little short story. Yeah. And I found it really emotional in a different way maybe than the other ones. And I think it spoke to me for personal reasons also.
Yeah. The only good parent in the
Mhm.
Parahumans.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
You're right. I love that interlude. And I'll let you talk in a minute. The only thing I wanted to say was that I haven't reread that, and when I read it the first time, I was not a father, and now I am. So I am really curious about how that hits me differently.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear about that because it probably will.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right broadly that one of the biggest differences between Worm and Ward, outside of specifically what it's trying to do, is you can tell Ward is a book that's written by an author with a lot more experience, and so he's trying to push the format a little bit. Like Worm is very I'm trying to think of a way to say this that doesn't make it seem like it's bad. It's very committed to its structure, in that we have this very kind of tried and true, here we have an arc, and then at the end of the arc we'll have an interlude, and then we'll move on from that. And he kind of pushes against that a little bit as the story goes on. But I think one of the things about Ward is that it just is constantly pushing against that structure, and Wildbow is never limiting himself in what he wants to do based on what the standard serial structure that he's created is. He'll say, I want to have 5 interludes in the middle of this arc, and I'm going to do it, and they're just going to be random in here, and I'm going to name them different things. And there's like it's funny because I remember having a very difficult time as we went kind of predicting, where there was a lot of talk about like, is this the last chapter of the arc? Are we moving on to another arc after this? And part of the reason we did that is because we were trying to figure out, okay, how do we structure this as far as episode releases? Is this the end of the arc? Because we do a little bit something extra at the end of arcs, and we never knew for sure. And I think I like that he's experimenting with the structure. And again, I haven't read much of Pale, but I understand he's gone on to further experiment with his serial structure.
Yeah. I don't know what exactly, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. I guess one of the big differences here, and maybe we can talk kind of a little bit about not necessarily the book, but covering the book, because we have kind of talked about how covering Ward is just so different from covering Worm the way we did, or covering the Stephen King books the way we do. And one of the big differences is it in the fandom. People that listen to our Kingslingers podcast pretty much like all the Stephen King books, right? Like I find it difficult to believe there's a huge chunk of listeners that are listening to us talk about these books that just don't like them, right?
Yeah.
Because they've been out for a while, and presumably you've read them, and that's not entirely true. There are some listeners I know for sure that have followed us from We've Got Ward over there, and have read the books kind of along with us for the very first time, and so some of them, didn't like the book. I know we had some people that started out with us early and then just kind of dropped off because the books weren't doing anything for them. So that's not 100% true, but I would say 95% of the people that listen to us week in and week out are really enjoying the content, and really enjoying the content we're making our content on. With Ward, that wasn't necessarily true, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a ton of people reading the book that just weren't liking the book. And then listening to us talk about a book that they just weren't liking. And so the feedback we got is so different than the feedback we got during We've Got Worm, and the feedback we currently get during Kingslingers. It's just so different. And it honestly, there's a lot of negativity to it, and there's a lot of it that left a bad taste in my mouth, of people just not liking the book and getting really mad at us because we did.
Well, yeah, I mean, getting mad at us, getting mad at choices in the book.
Yeah.
This is one of the problems with covering something live. As I sorry to step on what you were saying, but like the issue is you've committed to something. Maybe you thought it was going to be just like Worm. You thought it was going to be Worm too, and it's not being what you wanted it to be. And now you're kind of mad, and now you're kind of hate reading it, and that kind of messed up the whole dynamic. I mean, what's funny in retrospect, I think I can say this very clearly, is like it was maybe 1% of our listeners who were actually generating that negativity, like, because we can see the actual numbers. It was probably less than 1%. It was probably less than 1% of our listeners who were generating all the negativity. And what I regret is reacting to it. Like, it's waste. It's not that criticism of the book is invalid. It's just like, first of all, it was often the same criticisms over and over, and you're like, okay, fine, cool. you're entitled to your opinion, and then I can move on. But like it was hard to move on when it was like that was kind of the bullhorn was coming into like every week's thread, you know.
Yeah. And you're right. I think the worst part about it is it's not entertaining. Like at the end of the day, we're making a product that we want to be entertaining, and like us engaging with that kind of criticism is not very entertaining in my mind. And I mean,
No.
we made this mistake and we've got Worm, and I think we continue to make the mistake and we've got Ward. I think the difference is the criticism in Worm and Ward were so different because, again, I think the majority of people listening to us talk about Worm were people that really liked the book. So the criticism there was weird because it was like, Scott, you're really loving this book, but you're not loving it in the right way, which I always just found silly because it's like, okay, like we both really, really love this thing. I just see something different in it than you do, and you're getting mad at me for it. Okay, whatever. But there was a lot of it coming in Worm that were people that just flat out didn't like the story. They just weren't liking it. They weren't liking what it was doing. They didn't think it was well written. And again, that's fine. I don't care. I think one of the big changes in my life in the past couple of years is I'm much better now at just kind of looking at those comments and just being like, fuck off. And then just like moving on with my life. Right. Like I just don't care anymore. And to your point, it's not that criticism is not valid. There are plenty of reasons to not like this book, but this is not necessarily what we're talking about here. There's things in this book that I didn't like. Certainly. There's things that in the moment I didn't like. There's things that, you know, moving past it, I didn't like. We're wading into some shit here with this, Matt, but I'm still not certain how I feel about Amy as a character that exists in the story. And that's a thing that I think has, for me, aged particularly poorly. I understand her purpose in the novel and what she's doing and why that's important to what the novel is saying. But I just don't think she's the big exception to like everything that Wildbow does, and that I don't think she functions as a human being. She's just a monster, and that's it.
Yeah, I think my feeling is that I never think about that aspect of the story, and I think the reason is because it was so like different from everything else. It didn't fit. It didn't cohere. I'm speaking in terms of storytelling here. Like,
sure.
Like it was an element where it was almost like Amy as a story element worked perfectly until she actually showed up in the story, and then everything kind of fell apart. For it, and not in a way where it like fell apart and like, oh, the story's bad now. For me, it was more like, oh, this has turned into a different thing, and you know, obviously I think that's what Wildbow wanted to do with it. He wanted to take it in that direction, but for me, it became, I guess, more muddled than I'm used to from Wildbow. Like that's one thing I'll say about Wildbow is I would never describe Wildbow as muddled. Like the worst interlude he's ever written, I wouldn't call muddled. I would say he has a clear sense of where he's going with this. Maybe, you know, this and this didn't work about this chapter, but you're never unclear about like what you're supposed to walk away feeling about it. And the Amy stuff, I think there were like too many conflicting kind of factors involved.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of this comes from the fact that, you know, frankly, I missed what happened in Worm. I did not fully comprehend what happened in that book with Amy. And so I had an idea and expectations of Amy in my head leaving that book and moving on. And I think, you know, if you ask Wildbow, and I think we kind of did in the interview, one of his biggest critiques of himself would be that like he didn't nail the clarity of those scenes. And I think part of that is just being a very new writer who is writing one of the most disgusting and vile acts that a human being can do to another human being, and had understandable concern with being clear in it, because that would be very, very off-putting and disturbing. And so kind of tried to couch it as much as possible in gestures towards what happened. And a lot of people miss those gestures, myself included.
I think I want to center on that for a second, because it's so interesting to me how parahuman stories are full of the most fucked up shit.
Yeah.
I routinely have people tell me, like I in the circles I run in, I talk to a lot of people who've read Parahumans, or people who tell me, yeah, I tried to and I bounce off because it's just too horrific and dark. And what's funny to me is, like, I think you and I had this conversation where it's like, I guess our minds are warped from watching all those 80s action movies when we were 7 years old.
Yeah.
Because none of it's like, I kind of think the dark, heinous shit is awesome.
Mm-hmm.
But what was interesting to me, literally last week, we came upon this chapter of the Stephen King novel Black House that we're covering right now. And it was horrific. It was highly disturbing to me. And I was like, this is interesting. You know, this is interesting to me because it's not that I thought I was immune to being horrified, but it's really hard to horrify me. And it's like, well, why did this specific? I'm not going to spoil Black House, obviously, but it's like, I think everybody kind of has their own specific combination of factors that come into play, and it pushes them over the edge. And I think it's really difficult to play to swim in the waters that these stories exist in, because there's just horrible shit wall to wall.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very difficult to kind of have the appropriate level of sensitivity
yes,
while you're doing that, right? It's like, wait a minute, so like, I'm allowed to have Siberian walk around with 8 people shish kebabbed on her arms, but like I'm not. But like, if I do this thing over here, it's going to upset a lot of people, and it's not actually obvious like where those lines are.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think especially as a more, you know, journeyman writer, I think Wildbow wasn't quite secure on where that line was, or, you know, I don't even know if I knew that such a line existed until it was evidently stumbled across a few times, and then people reacted, you know. Well,
I mean, we as a culture are understandably very sensitive about sexual assault, you know,
okay, I don't want to contradict, obviously you were right, but shish kebabbing people is also really horrible. It's just, it's horrible in a way that's comically unrealistic,
right,
to the point where your brain just kind of goes like, you know, which is kind of an interesting, weird fact about humans, that we have that reaction for something that is objectively, like, it would be the worst thing you've ever seen if you saw that in real life, but we just laugh it off if it's in fiction.
Yeah, well, because nobody's actually bone sawing people, but people are raping people all the time, and like,
yes, you're right. I'm agreeing with you. I'm just sort of indicating that why it's sometimes hard to figure out where that line might be.
Right. And so, like, I think going into Ward, you have a book where, okay, my protagonist is going to be a victim of sexual assault, and her you know, rapist is going to be a character in the book. And how do I do this? And, you know, going into the book, I honestly thought not that there was going to be catharsis or forgiveness or anything going on between them necessarily, but I also did not have a clear picture in my head of what actually happened. And part of the mission of this book is to make that very, very clear. And it does that by kind of just making Amy into an unrepentant monster, which I'm not saying is the wrong choice. Like, I'm not saying that. Like, there's certainly people that exist like that in the real world, right? That just have no concept of what they did was wrong. And I think there are moments in the book that I think do a really good job of getting into Amy's head and kind of understanding why she cannot see that what she did was wrong. But I do feel like as we move further and further into the story, I think the mission seems to be coming from a book in which it wasn't clear, and that's okay. Let's be like, me saying it wasn't clear as an opinion, not a statement of fact, right? But it wasn't clear exactly what happened in those Amy interludes, and so I, the author, and I don't. First of all, we're making a lot of suppositions here. We don't actually know these things, right? We haven't talked to Wildbow specifically about this, so we're supposing. I want to make it very, 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 very clear in this book what happened. And so I'm going to be very, very clear with who Amy is and what she does and why the thing she does is bad. And then it just kind of flattens her a little bit in a way that I found less satisfying. I'm totally fine with her being a monster. Totally fine with that.
Yeah.
But
I mean, yeah.
She was just a little bit more two-dimensional than a lot of other Wildbow characters tend to be.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the reason for that is, you know, she, as a character, we crossed this line that that kind of doesn't allow her to be humanized. It's
Mhm.
interesting. Now I can just say like, oh, Amy has borderline personality disorder,
Mhm.
which is not a term that I knew at the time, or maybe I knew it, but I didn't understand that
Yeah.
that was exactly like I think we tried a few times to be like, well, she, you know, you can kind of describe her. It's like, no, she just has BPD. She has borderline personality disorder. You read the symptomology of BPD, it just describes Amy. It's
Mhm.
it's exactly Amy. It's fear of abandonment, unstable, intense, idealizing relationships of people, rapidly changing self-image and goals, risky behavior, uh, 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 spontaneous, self-destructive decisions, feelings of emptiness, losing your temper, mood swings. 100%. So like Wildbow's like, he's not even like reaching into the depths of hell to like pull out some caricature of like a bad person. It's like, oh, this is not even that uncommon of a personality disorder. And you know, I think that's one of the interesting things about the whole approach here is like by that I mean like the idea of these parahumans characters being like flawed people who we can relate to. It actually becomes a little bit wobbly when you start talking about severe personality disorders,
Yeah.
because if you don't have a like a personality disorder is a distinct thing from a lot of the other problems that people struggle with, and they're much harder to treat. Typically people with personality disorders don't want them to be treated because they don't think there's anything wrong with them. It's I think it's not a coincidence that relatively few of the characters in Parahumans have what you would call a personality disorder, and the ones that do are basically like Amy, Jack Slash,
Cradle, right?
you know, Cradle to, yeah, definitely Cradle, like the ones who are sort of just like, this person just sucks and like we want them to die, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's kind of an interesting thing that kind of emerged for me over time.
Sure.
Especially as I became more aware of like the finer points of the symptomology of personality disorders.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on there, and yeah, I mean, like overall, it's a pretty minor complaint. It's funny because we started this talking about how I don't care about other people's complaints, and I
Well,
was trying to justify my statement by showing one of the things that I didn't particularly love, and then we went on a whole rabbit hole. But hey, the people that listen to the show know we do that. I just think like to kind of try to wrangle us back to the topic at hand. I just think that like it was an interesting experience watching people not hate read. Is maybe too harsh of a statement, but there certainly were some of those people, and having to interact with those people in a way that we hadn't before and haven't since. That you know, for us, this is a pretty unique phenomenon in everything that we've covered, because we didn't really see that in Worm, haven't really seen that in any of the Dark Tower stuff, specific only to Ward.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I think it's interesting because that is yet again one of the problems with the keeping up with something alive phenomenon is I think that people got the impression that they could like actually persuade us that the book was bad, and it's like that's probably not something we should have fed.
Yeah,
not that we fed it too much, but I think even by responding to certain things, it is a way of feeding that.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of this was just, you know, coming out of Worm, it was the first time we had an audience, and so people were giving us feedback, and we were like, oh my God, there's people listening to us, let's respond to each and every one of them. And yeah, I mean, a lot of it is growing and learning which are the things that you can just freely say, you know, I don't, even if you're right, I don't see any need for me to engage in that particular line of
right.
things.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think it's kind of somewhat important to say this. Like now, when I see somebody who disagrees with me about a take that I had on a podcast, I'm usually just like, that's interesting, and then I just move on with my day. Like, it's not like I'm like, you know, you idiot.
Yeah,
and it's not like I like. I'm just like, I don't. It's not possible for me to react to that, and that's, I think that's the healthier way of doing what we're doing. Like because it was, I don't think it was. I think, like you said, it actually was kind of a source of ongoing negativity when we were having to deal with those things.
It ruined my days too. Like,
Mhm.
like I would allow these things to ruin my day in a way that was extremely unhealthy for me. And
Mhm.
you're right. I finally got into a place where I don't let it do that before. Because like we said, we still get emails and messages from people about shows that we've done 5 years ago. My favorite comments are the ones that are talking about something very specifically that I said 4 years ago that I have absolutely no memory of, and therefore could not even defend to myself if I wanted to. So my mental way of dealing with that is, oh, they're probably right, because
Mhm.
I don't remember. Oh, they're probably right about that. So okay,
Yeah.
and I just move on.
I mean, what's funny, sometimes I'm like, I bet that if they just listen to the next episode, then that thing that they're complaining about will be addressed, and
Mhm.
so I'll just let that take care of itself.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about this at the end of Ward, but like the stuff we did in Worm with the you're being unfair to Taylor, and I regret all that, and not because it wasn't fun at some points, but just like I just don't think that's the type of show I wanted to produce. And we've got plenty of emails from people on the Stephen King stuff that are just like, I flat out disagree with your interpretation of who Roland is as a human being. And yeah, my reaction is just like, that's cool. I'm glad. I'm glad that we don't agree. That's great. I'm sometimes just listening to a person that disagrees with you helps you clarify your own opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a bad thing.
Right. Well, I think there's this also, I've come to the realization that like, or I've really internalized the idea that like there's no such thing as being right about most of these things. So it's like, yeah, this is how I feel about the story. Well, I don't know what you're trying to accomplish. Like,
right. And people are in constant flux. So like the person that talked about Worm 5 years ago is not the same person that I am now. Like not even close. Like that, I would probably read different parts of that completely differently. I don't think my fundamental opinion of what the themes of the book are doing would shift, but like the individual moments and scenes, I'm a way different person. I've experienced a lot of different things in my life since then, and so it's constantly changing and in flux. So yeah, there's no one right answer to any of this, and there never is. And I totally understand defending your opinion. I get that, but like, don't expend too much energy doing that because it just doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think, this is one of the underlying reasons why we have this attitude of I love this, which has kind of become the company motto, which is just like, it's kind of just a waste of all of your psychic juices to just go on and on about how something's bad.
Yeah.
And it's much more fun and rewarding to talk about how it's good. And if you disagree with me and you don't think it's good, then like you don't have to correct me. It's fine. Yeah. Just let let it go.
Let it go. Yeah. Taylor was perfect. Just let it go.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's Ward. I loved this book, Matt. I really did. I really did love it. And I have such, with the exception of all the negativity we just spent the last 20 minutes talking about, I have such fond memories of covering this book, of getting to hang out with you every week and talk about it and try to guess where the story was going, try to figure out what's going on, try to figure out why Eric actually isn't all that bad. Because he's a normal guy. He's fine. Why do we hate this guy so much?
I see.
He's totally fine.
Trying to just drive the episode into the ditch. Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, it was a huge part of our lives. I mean, I especially because it was sort of a continuation with the Worm Project, so it was just like this this huge chunk of our lives. And I do think about the stories a lot, especially in times of crisis and struggle, which I think, I don't know what better compliment I can pay them, right? Yeah. Like if it's your source of stability in hard times, then it is by definition very important to you, right? So that is still what it is to me, even 2 years on.
That's so great, and I agree with you. I think there's I will never forget the characters of Breakthrough. I will always remember these kids and the things that they were struggling with, and kind of the moments of awe at the way they look at a problem that I think would completely knock me down and prevent me from getting back up, and they find a way to get through it. It's inspiring, and it makes you want to be a better person. It makes you want to work a little harder. It makes you want to be a little less resentful, a little less angry, a little more forgiving, a little more accepting. all these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
What a great book. Loved it.
All right. Well, Scott, are we done talking about Ward now?
I think we are done officially talking about Ward, at least for another 2 years.
At least for another 2 years, yeah. So what are we up to these days?
Yeah, so if you miss our dulcet tones, and by that I mean Matt's, because my voice is fine. Matt's is great. We are, as we've talked about many times on this show so far, we are continuing our exploration of Stephen King. We went through his entire Dark Tower series, and then we've spent the last year going through the books tangential to the Dark Tower series. We're covering a book Black House right now, and we'll be covering Stephen King's The Stand here in a couple months. So if you have read these books or have not read these books, but you want to listen to people talk about some books, you can check those out. We're also continuing to produce our Doofcast show. Matt, what are we doing right now on the Doofcast? We're doing a huge project.
Yeah, we're doing deconstructing Ridley Scott, which means we go through every one of Ridley Scott's films in order, week by week, and we talk about that movie in detail. And we did a few weeks ago, we did Alien and Blade Runner, which are a couple of his earliest films, actually. Those were really great conversations. We've done a few different deconstructing director series, and just covered a bunch of stuff over on the Doofcast. And I don't know if people know or remember that we also do a monthly book club on the Doofcast feed, where we do a different novel every month. We've done over 50 of them now. So we've been doing that for over 50 months, which is kind of crazy. I think well over 50 now. And right now we're doing The Terror by Dan Simmons. Is that right? Dan Simmons, yeah. Which I'm really enjoying a lot.
I am too. That's going to be coming out next Friday, so the 27th of May, I think. Yeah.
The Stephen King project, though, I just want to mention, like the Wildbow project was us being relatively young podcasters, and me saying hey, this is one of my favorite authors. I can virtually guarantee you're gonna love this story. and then I trapped you into talking about that for several years, and now it was your turn to be well, Matt, this is one of my favorite authors, and I can virtually guarantee you're gonna like this. And I have.
Yeah.
So Stephen King, it's funny because I had very little familiarity with Stephen King before we started the project, but he's risen to be one of my favorite authors as well, and that's been a really great project.
Makes me so happy. And I love Stephen King, obviously. And it's so fascinating to me. He is such a different author than Wildbow is, right? He what he's trying to do, what he wants to do, they're different. So, it's the same two people talking about two completely different authors. And so, we kind of approach the books the same way, where we have specific things we like talking about, which is, the overall is the really fun thing about this format, is that the format is so heavily based on you and me and the things we like in stories and the things we like talking about in stories, which is very specific and unique to us. There's been a lot of projects since We've Got Worm that have taken that same central idea and run with it, both in Worm itself and in some other books. And people sometimes ask us how we feel about these things. Well, obviously we like it a lot because we've brought some of them on board our platform. But in general, I think it's just cool because, first of all, it's flattering. And then second of all, every single human being is going to talk about a different thing when reading a book, because you're just different. And so if Ruben and Elliot were to cover Ward or Worm, they would talk about different things than we did. If we were to cover Pale, we talk about different things than they did. And so it's just really cool to see what different people pull out of the same piece of media. So I love all those projects. I got distracted though. The point I'm saying is Stephen King is so different. And so our conversations are a little bit different because he's trying to do different things, but it's just so fun to talk about them.
Yeah. Right. I feel as we've covered just so many different things on all these projects, we've picked up more tools for talking about stories too.
I don't think it's too conceited to say we've never been better at this than we are right now.
I agree that it's not too conceited, because if you didn't get better at something after practicing it this many hours, then that would be really embarrassing.
Yeah, you're right. But I hope I'm better.
I think if we were to go back in time and do Worm again with our current skill set, it would be quite a different show, actually.
Yeah.
Not, I think what we did was great, but like also like I just have so many more ways to take things now. So
Yeah, for sure. And like I said, we're different people. Like I, as a father, I don't know how I'd probably be like, man, Danny's the fucking best. He's a perfect dad. He never did anything wrong. All right, Matt, that is going to do it for us. Make sure you check out all those shows. And y'all, if you aren't listening to Pale Reflections or Pale in Comparisons, the two podcasts running on Wildbow Works on our network right now that are covering both Pale and Pact, I don't know what you're doing. Why aren't you listening to those? It's our friends, Ruben and Elliot and Malia and Jenny, talking about the same books that you love. So you should be downloading them and listening to them. What are you doing?
What are you doing? Well,
but you can check all those out. Go to doofmedia.com and you can see everything we're currently doing. Make sure you follow us on Twitter at doofmedia and subscribe on YouTube to make sure you don't miss anything that we are ever doing, because we didn't even announce that we're doing this episode, Matt. We're just going to drop this tomorrow.
Yeah. Remember how we used to give our Twitter handles at the end of every episode and nobody would ever fucking follow us?
Well, yeah, but
at More Than a Mail. Go follow me on Twitter.
Matt, the thing is, nobody knows how to fucking spell that. You picked the worst possible name.
I know.
I don't even know how to pronounce it. It's been 6 years. All right, that's going to do it for us. I don't remember how we ended these episodes. So
I didn't copy that part of the script over.
We're just going to have to end it.
Yeah. Watch out for your trigger event. Everybody.
Long days and pleasant superpowers.
Yep.